What's up everyone, this is Oscar from Underdog, and today we're going to be talking about breakbeats. But not breakbeats in the sense of like the amen break, but rather just broken down, deconstructed house and garage beats that you hear in artists like Burial, Quartet, Ross from Friends, Barry Can't Swim, Bonobo, and I bet there's a million others. Here are some audio examples of the vibe we're going for. I was thinking I really love beats like this, so what makes them hit exactly the way that they do? And I've done the study, I've done the analysis, and I'm here to report my findings. Let's get into it together, but first we're going to do that classic YouTube thing, which is subscribing and liking and leaving an adorable comment so I feel good and then the algorithm knows that and it boosts me, which would be so nice. Before we even get into the software, first I gotta tell you something about drums. Now, this is a djembe, and it's a lovely piece of art. However, it's totally busted. So we're gonna just have to talk in theory here. When you're drumming on a djembe, and YouTube is full of proper djembe players, so go watch them, don't watch me. When you're playing on a djembe, you've got three ways of hitting this thing. You might refer to it as three different voices. There's the bass right in the middle, there's the tone on the edge, and then the slap very much on the edge. And you can kind of think of that as three different types of percussion: the lows, the mids, and the highs. And that's relevant to us today because we're going to break it down into these three layers. We've got low percussion, mid percussion, and high percussion as part of our breakbeat loop. And on top of that, we might add extra stable hi-hats or something, but the core danceability of our loop really depends on these three tones and alternating rapidly between them in 16th notes. Let me explain that to you properly. All right, I've been working on a beat and it sounds a bit like this, right? But we're not going to go into this too much. What we are going to go into is the principles behind it and the ideas so that you can do it yourself and not mimic this exact beat. So on an empty MIDI track, I'm just going to work with a 707 core kits because it sounds super vanilla and we're just talking about programming patterns right now, not too much sound design, okay? But most importantly, we're going to think about our three drum sounds: the lows, the mids, and the highs. And the lows, very easy, that's going to be a bass drum. The mids can be many different sounds, and particularly we're going to work with the snare. But one nice complement to the snare could also be the rim shot. You can alternate them or invert one for the other. These are all very mid-focused percussions. Even a clap. Very mid. Very mid. Okay, that's Gen Z's watching. I know. It's pebbles. Anyway, that's low, that's mid, and then highs. We're just going to use a close hi-hats. Easy, easy. So we're going to be working in a 1-bar pattern with 16th notes, and crucially we're also going to apply some swing. So every second 16th note we're going to push back a little bit, and we're just going to do it by hand. I know there are all sorts of ways like in Ableton using grooves or whatever. We're just going to do it by hand because it's not that complicated, and then you can visually see what's going on. So the bass drum. I feel like a breakbeat shouldn't be 4 on the floor. Like it could be, there's no rule against it, and it happens, but let's, for the case of today, instead program something more like this. Now remember what I said about applying a little bit of swing? We're just going to apply just a touch of swing on these bass drums that fall on the weak 16th. Cool. Now we're going to be adding mid and high percussion, and here's one formula that I want you to learn just to apply so you understand why this works. I want you to do a mid percussion, but make it really soft. I want you to do a high percussion, and then I want you to do another mid percussion. We're alternating. Mid, high, mid, low on 4 steps of 16th notes. And we're going to, as we said, we're going to push these weak 16ths back a bit to add some swing. Now let's see what this feels like. For me, this is already the kind of pattern that touches at the soul of this kind of programming. See if we add in some secondary elements. Now our pattern is a bit empty, so of course you have to think that extra layers will come. For example, you could add in some hi-hats. You can add in some extra wriggly bits, as I call them. I'm talking about these bits. Let's discuss how to make them in a second. You hear those little layers, those wriggly bits? Ear candy. Nice. And so you're like, yeah, Oscar, that's one pattern. That's like giving a man a fish, but not teaching a man to fish. You can copy one pattern, but what if you want a different fish? Okay, let's deepen our fishing lesson. So my suggestion is that this is satisfying because you're alternating. Remember the djembe from earlier? Think about the 3 different voices, low, medium, and high. And the satisfying part happens when we alternate them in patterns of swung sixteenths. So let's apply that idea further. So let's delete this and take this idea further. Let's add in a close hi-hat before this one. And then let's add in a mid hit right afterwards. And let's add in a mid one here as well. Now this is working for me. So you see, we're just filling up the grid of sixteenths, but we're alternating low, mid, and high. And it's satisfying, and it's cool, and it's groovy. And we're not worrying about hi-hats or shakers because we're going to add those over top as a steady pulse, almost like a metronome. I did a video about do you know where your metronome is? Go watch that. I think it's very relevant. But in this case, we would just add some. And our ticking metronome gives us some context. And we can then groove to these groovy bits. Now, I do think it's very important when creating a drum beat that it is wise to make it conscious in your mind if there is a backbeat, and if so, where. A backbeat might sound something like this. If you think about the low and the mid percussion, they have to kind of talk to each other. And the most classical backbeat pattern would be, right? Most classical one. And one thing that happens a lot is that second one might be rushed. See, it just pushed it one to the left and then make it swing a little bit and you get something like nice. Now with this kind of repetitive, stable kick drum pattern, that doesn't really work so well. So you might want to vary that a little bit. So here we've got low and mid, and we feel our backbeat. We feel that the low and the mids are talking to each other. It's boom, kick, kick, boom, boom, kick. There are many sweet spots of this configuration that could work together. But then, okay, if we've got our backbeats dialed in, maybe we can sweeten it up a little bit by adding a little bit of these breakbeat elements, aka adding in mid and high and lows alternating. So let's see if we can make it work. And so like that, you get the workings of a pretty serviceable breakbeat pattern. And it might be interesting to take one of those hits and replace it with a synthesizer sound. Like in my pattern here, put a little synth sound here. I guess I'm kind of treating this like a high sound in this case. And so this little placeholder hit, I ran it out to a synthesizer and it became something like this. But this synthesizer is used as a percussion element almost. I mean, it also contributes to the harmony of the song, but it's part of the drum groove in a very intentional way. And honestly, I just want to give credit where credit is due. So the thing that triggered this whole rabbit hole a bit is this track by Ross from Friends, where I really love the beat. And so here we are. So there we are. We're done. If you want to leave, you can leave now. You're free to go. You do not have to hang out here if you don't want to. I'm just going to show you two more things for those of you who are interested. Like once you've got your drums dialed in a bit like this, you want to start adding texture to your composition, texture surrounding it. So for example, consider adding some drones. Just stable tones coming from a soft synth or whatever, and they don't move, they just hold the tone. What those are playing might be the root note of the scale or some strong interval with relationship to the root note, depending on how much tension you want to create, right? But these kind of harmonically set the canvas for everything that's going to come later. And then, we've already alluded to it earlier, but these little, what I'm going to call Wriggly Bits, ear candy that make things feel loose and organic. Here, let's bring those up real loud. Let's turn off this sidechain compression for now. Now I've sidechained them heavily to the beats, but let's just leave that off for now. What's a simple way of doing this? Well, this, for example, is literally just a matter of taking your core drums, Command D, which duplicates, and you go and you find your favorite crazy delay plugin. You just browse through some presets and you set your mix to 100%. And then you would freeze and flatten, but actually let me just use Ableton's native one, just to prove that you don't need to all go out and buy Echo Boy. Here, you just make it completely wet, set the feedback really high, protect your ears, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the time so it's going to speed up and slow down, and do that really slow. Then I only want the mid frequencies. The idea here is to create something loose that feels kind of messy, so that sits nicely when you make it up loud, sit nicely next to your core drums. And so now, of course, you want to sculpt that a little bit so that it doesn't interfere with your main drums. And I mean, just sidechain compression will probably do fine. But don't hesitate in cases like this to just freeze and flatten. And so now you've got your audio and that's playing for the entire loop. That can be awesome, but maybe you don't want it playing the entire time. Well, maybe you can just chop it up and have it play only sometimes. Or you can drag it into a MIDI track, put it into a simpler, simply slice and set the sensitivity kind of low so it starts in different places, and then draw in some notes. So you can just pepper those into your loop to add in little bits of spice here and there. And that would get you something like this. Now this is subtle, but it's quite beautiful, and you're sculpting and giving all sorts of interesting depth to something that's otherwise quite a stale loop. And when you're adding stuff like this, think of your loop as a space of maybe 4 or 8 bars or whatever your length is, and think of the zones at the start and at the end. At the start, we're going to call them markers. At the start of your loop, sometimes you might have imagine like a crash cymbal that goes psh, some musical element that marks the start of your loop. So that could be a bunch of these delay bubbles or whatever the heck you want to place there. That's the zone of the marker. Sometimes you really want to emphasize that. And then at the end of your loop, you've got the transition zone, which we're going to call the turnaround. The turnaround might be a little bit of a change up before we start the loop again. And so you can do something interesting in those zones, especially in the turnaround, in terms of your drum programming and in terms of these secondary effects that you're going to add in. That way you don't add in effects in a super random way, or you don't add them everywhere where it can be a bit fatiguing. But I would encourage you to just keep bouncing versions of your drums and putting them through all sorts of the wildest effects. What are some of my favorites? Well, there's Crystallizer, there's Echo Boy. I love Trash as well. I think that's an iconic statement for me on the channel. I love Trash. I think that should be on my tombstone probably. Things like Other Desert Cities or Portal, which are like granular delay effects. Push them to their logical extremes, flick through the presets, just get to weird sounds, bounce those to audio and pepper them in to taste over your drum loop. And now as an outro, let me add some vocals to this, maybe do a little dance and congratulate you for being so freaking awesome. Go follow my courses on courses.underdog.brussels. Come show us on the Discord channel what you did with this, and until next time, stay producing, be good to each other, and take care.